My daughter didn't invite us to her wedding, and by the time her special day ended, she was begging at my door, claiming she was pregnant with my grandchild. But I knew the truth. Let me tell you how 40 years of sacrifice taught me the hardest lesson of my life. My name is Beatrice Walsh, and I'm 72 years old. For 4 decades, I managed industrial kitchens in Manhattan, making sure senators and celebrities got their salmon cooked just right. My husband Walter spent those same 40 years working double shifts at a factory in Queens. We lived modestly in our Brooklyn apartment, saving every penny we could. Why? Because we had one daughter, Vanessa, and we wanted to give her everything we never had. The etiquette classes, the tennis lessons, the French tutoring. We paid for it all. When she got engaged to Preston Sterling, some trust fund boy from Connecticut, we didn't hesitate. We emptied our life savings for her dream wedding. $10,000 for the dress alone. Rare orchids. A 200-person banquet. Every cent we'd ever saved went into that one day. I thought it would be the proudest moment of my life. Instead, it became the day I lost a daughter and found myself again. This is the story of how my child tried to erase me from her perfect day, and how I showed her that some things in life can't be bought with borrowed money and fake smiles. It's about the moment when a mother's unconditional love finally runs out, and what happens when the people who underestimated you realize they should have read the fine print. Stay with me, because what happened at those mansion gates changed everything I thought I knew about family, loyalty, and my own worth. That Saturday morning started like any other wedding day should. I woke up at 5 with that electric feeling in my chest, the kind you get when something big is about to happen. The sun was barely up over Brooklyn, but my mind was already at the Hudson Valley, at that historic mansion where Vanessa would say her vows. Walter was already awake, standing in front of our bedroom mirror in his gray suit. It was the only suit he owned, but he'd had it pressed so carefully it looked almost new. I watched his hands tremble as he adjusted his tie for the 3rd time. He turned to me with worry in his eyes and told me he wasn't sure we'd fit in, that the Sterlings were a different kind of people, that maybe we should prepare ourselves. I put on my navy blue dress, the nicest one I owned, and told him we were the parents of the bride. More importantly, we were the ones paying for everything. Without our sweat and sacrifice, those aristocrats would be drinking tap water at their fancy party. We got into our old sedan and drove north in reverent silence. I'd been to that mansion once before, years ago, when I catered an event there. The owner, Joe Moretti, was an old friend from the restaurant business. He'd only agreed to rent it out because I'd called in a personal favor. Vanessa had told Preston's family that she'd secured the venue herself through her connections and charm. I'd let that lie slide. It was her day, after all. The drive took 90 minutes. I spent most of it going through mental checklists, making sure I hadn't forgotten anything. The photographer, the florist, the string quartet, I'd coordinated it all. Vanessa had been too busy with her new friends to handle the details herself. She'd said planning was stressful and that I was so much better at it anyway. When those iron gates came into view, my heart started racing. This was it, the culmination of 40 years of sacrifice. I imagined Vanessa's face when she saw us walk in, how she'd hug us and thank us for making her dreams come true. But the gates were closed, not just closed, locked, and there were no valets waiting to park cars, no ushers in tuxedos greeting guests. There were only 2 security guards in tactical uniforms standing behind the bars. Walter slowed the car, confused. He suggested maybe we had the wrong entrance, that perhaps the main gate was somewhere else. But I'd already seen it. My eyes aren't what they used to be, but even from 30 feet away, that image was unmistakable. It was a photograph taped to the iron gate, a picture of Walter and me, taken on our front porch just last week. We'd been gardening, laughing about something silly, wearing our old work clothes. I'd sent that photo to Vanessa with a message telling her we loved her and couldn't wait for her big day. Someone had printed it out, enlarged it, and defaced it. Over our smiling faces was a thick red X. Above it, In bold letters were the words, "Access denied. Security risk. Do not allow entry." The air left my lungs like I'd been punched in the stomach. Walter's voice cracked when he asked if this was some kind of joke, if maybe the security guards had made a mistake. But I knew better. This wasn't a mistake. This was deliberate. I looked up at the mansion's main balcony, and there she was, Vanessa, absolutely stunning in her $10,000 imported lace gown, holding a champagne flute. Standing beside her was Victoria Sterling, Preston's mother, dressed in what looked like a designer suit worth more than our car. They were both staring down at us, and they were laughing. Victoria pointed at our sedan and said something that made Vanessa cover her mouth in amusement. My daughter didn't look embarrassed, she didn't look conflicted, she looked relieved. Then Vanessa did something that burned itself into my memory forever. She raised her champagne glass toward us in a mock toast, a gesture that clearly said goodbye and good riddance, and turned her back. Just turned around and walked away like we were nothing. Like 40 years of love and sacrifice could be dismissed with a wave of her manicured hand. We weren't wanted there. We'd been useful as checkbooks, necessary as financiers. But we were embarrassing as actual guests. We were the help, and the help doesn't sit at the table with real society. Walter started crying. Not the quiet, dignified tears of a sentimental father, but harsh, choking sobs that shook his whole body. In 43 years of marriage, I'd seen him cry maybe 3 times. This was different. This was the sound of a man's heart breaking in real time. That's when something inside me shifted. The sadness I'd felt just seconds before solidified into something else entirely. Something cold and hard and sharp. The kind of clarity that only comes when you've been pushed past your breaking point. I told Walter to turn the car around. He looked at me in disbelief and said we needed to talk to her, that there had to be some explanation, that our daughter wouldn't really do this to us. But I'd seen her face. I'd seen that toast. I knew exactly what this was. I repeated myself slower this time. I told him to turn the car around because we didn't have a daughter anymore. As our sedan pulled away from those iron gates, I reached for my phone and pulled out my old black planner. The one I'd kept for decades, filled with contacts from every kitchen, every restaurant, every catering company I'd ever worked with. I knew every vendor at that wedding personally. I'd chosen them. I'd negotiated with them. And most importantly, I'd paid them. My finger found the first number. Lucas, the head waiter. I'd trained him 15 years ago when he was just a skinny kid washing dishes in the Bronx. Now he ran one of the most respected catering crews in New York. He answered on the second ring, sounding frantic. He asked where I was and told me Mrs. Sterling was screaming about the place settings being wrong. I could hear the chaos in the background, the clinking of glasses, the murmur of arriving guests. I told him very calmly that the primary client had withdrawn sponsorship. He asked what I meant, confusion obvious in his voice. I explained that I was the client. I'd paid for the food, the drinks, the staff, everything. And I was canceling the contract due to breach of terms. I instructed him to stop service immediately. Close the bar. If anyone wanted to eat or drink, they could present the bill to Mrs. Sterling or to Preston. Payment required upfront, in cash. He protested that they'd kill him, that he'd never work again. I told him they didn't have the money to kill him, and that he should lock up the wine cellar while he was at it. That premium reserve I'd ordered, that was my property, not theirs. I hung up and immediately dialed Joe Moretti. Joe answered on the first ring. He sounded happy, asking if I was enjoying the wedding, if everything was going smoothly. I told him I needed him to know something important. Vanessa had told the Sterlings that the mansion was hers, a family gift, that she owned the property. The silence on the other end lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then I heard Joe swear in Italian, a string of words I hadn't heard since my grandmother was alive. He said Vanessa claiming ownership violated the insurance policy. If they believed the property was theirs, that changed everything legally. I agreed and pointed out that the rental contract explicitly required my presence as the named renter. Since I wasn't there, and since they'd actively barred me from entry, that meant everyone inside was there without proper authorization. Joe finished my thought. Trespassing. He told me he was on his way with his dogs. I knew what that meant. Joe kept 2 Dobermans trained for property security. Walter and I drove back to Brooklyn in complete silence. The only sound was the occasional sob catching in his throat. When we got to our apartment, he sat down on our old sofa and stared at nothing. He asked me why, his voice barely a whisper. Why would she do this after everything we'd given her? I told him the truth. Because we'd never said no, not once in 30 years. 20 minutes later, my phone started vibrating. Vanessa's name appeared on the screen. I rejected the call. Then Preston called. Rejected. Then Victoria. Rejected. I turned the phone off completely. I knew exactly what was happening at that mansion. Lucas stopping the servers mid-service. The bartender closing down the open bar. The $4,000 bill for the first hour being presented to a horrified Victoria Sterling. The lights being cut. The string quartet packing up. And then Joe arriving with his Dobermans, escorting the cream of high society off his property like common trespassers. What I didn't expect was the pounding on our apartment door an hour later. I looked through the peephole and felt my stomach turn. It was them, all 3 of them. Vanessa still in her wedding dress, but now the hem was muddy and the makeup was running down her face in black streaks. Preston with his tie loosened and his hair disheveled, smelling like cheap whiskey even through the door, and Victoria looking like someone had dragged her backwards through a hedge. Vanessa hammered on the door and screamed that we'd ruined her life, that we'd humiliated her in front of everyone who mattered, that we'd destroyed her future. I opened the door, but left the chain lock engaged. I looked my daughter in the eyes and told her they weren't welcome here. Security risk, remember? Her face changed instantly. The anger disappeared, and that manipulative sweetness came out, the same tone she'd used since she was 5 years old to get what she wanted. She begged me to understand, said she could explain everything. Then came the bomb. She told me she was pregnant, that we couldn't leave our grandchild homeless, that Joe had kicked them out with nowhere to go, that Preston was broke, that they needed to come inside right now. I saw Walter's face light up behind me. Hope, desperate and painful, flooded his expression. He whispered the word pregnant like it was a prayer. Victoria seized the moment. She pushed forward and announced that there was an heir, a grandchild, and that we were treating our own flesh and blood like garbage. I walked calmly to the drawer by our front door. Inside was an envelope that had arrived on Tuesday, 3 days before the wedding. I'd opened it, read it, and put it away, not thinking much of it at the time. Now I understood exactly why it had been sent to our address instead of hers. I slid the paper through the gap in the door. I told them it was curious because the Women's Health Clinic had sent a reminder about Vanessa's 3-year contraceptive implant, the one she'd had inserted just last month. The silence in that hallway was absolute. You could have heard a pin drop 3 floors down. Preston grabbed the paper from Vanessa's hand and read it. His face went from pale to red to purple. He turned on her and accused her of lying, said she'd told him they were going to have a baby to secure our inheritance money. I laughed. I actually laughed. I told Preston that we were working class. The only inheritance was the $50,000 fund we'd scraped together over a lifetime of 16-hour days and skipped vacations. Victoria's eyes went wide. She demanded to know where the money was, screamed that we needed to transfer it immediately. She called it compensation for emotional damages, for the humiliation we'd caused. I pulled out another receipt. I told them I'd made a bank transfer at 4:30 that afternoon. The entire $50,000 had gone to the St. Jude Hospice Support Fund. Anonymous donation. Non-refundable. Vanessa slid down the wall, sobbing for real now. But I could tell the tears weren't for us, weren't for the relationship she'd destroyed. They were for the money. She asked in disbelief if we'd really burned $50,000. I corrected her. I told her I'd purchased our freedom, and now they needed to leave or I'd call the police. Preston lunged forward and tried to kick the door in. But Walter appeared beside me, holding our old cast-iron skillet, the one we'd had since our wedding day. He told Preston that if he took one more step, he'd show him what a factory worker does when someone breaks into his home. They backed up. All three of them. I called 911 while they were still standing there. The police arrived within 10 minutes and escorted them out of our building under threat of arrest for disturbing the peace. When the silence finally returned, Walter looked at me with empty eyes. He asked what we were supposed to do now. No money, no daughter, nothing. I walked to the refrigerator and pulled out a brochure I'd been hiding for 3 months. I'd picked it up from a travel agency back in September before all the wedding planning had consumed our lives. I showed him the glossy photos of the California Zephyr train route. First-class tickets from New York to San Francisco. Panoramic windows, all meals included, private compartments. I told him I'd sold his father's old garage the day before, the one that had been sitting empty in Queens for 15 years. Walter stared at me in shock. A real estate developer had paid cash, enough for the train tickets and 3 months of travel along the West Coast. We were leaving the next morning at 8. Walter started crying again, but this time they were tears of relief. He hugged me tighter than he had in years. For the first time in decades, we weren't servants to someone else's dreams. We were the main characters of our own story. That night, while packing our suitcases, I found the crumpled photograph I'd grabbed from the gate. That red X over our faces. Those words, "Access denied." I threw it in the trash. We didn't need anyone's permission to be happy. We just needed to close the door. The California Zephyr pulled out of Penn Station at 8:15 the next morning. Walter and I sat in our private compartment watching the city disappear behind us. Neither of us had slept much. My phone, which I'd turned back on briefly, had 17 missed calls and 43 text messages. I deleted them all without reading them and powered it off again. Our cabin attendant, a woman named Marie who looked about my age, brought us coffee and pastries. She asked if we were celebrating something special. I told her we were celebrating our freedom. She smiled like she understood exactly what I meant. The first day on that train was strange. Walter and I kept looking at each other, waiting for the other shoe to drop, waiting for someone to call and tell us we'd made a terrible mistake. But the phone stayed off, and the train kept moving west, and slowly, very slowly, we started to breathe. We were somewhere in Pennsylvania when Walter finally spoke about what happened. He told me he kept replaying that moment at the gate in his mind, kept seeing Vanessa's face as she toasted our departure. He asked if I thought we'd been too harsh, if maybe we should have tried to talk to her, to understand why she did it. I reminded him about the contraceptive implant paperwork. That hadn't been a panicked lie in the moment. That had been a calculated plan. She'd intended to fake a pregnancy to manipulate us into giving her the money, into staying quiet about being excluded from the wedding, into accepting our place as the embarrassing relatives who paid for everything but weren't good enough to attend. Walter went quiet after that. I watched him process it, watched decades of unconditional love slowly harden into something more realistic, more honest. By the time we reached Chicago the next day, I'd started to think about what had actually happened at that mansion after we left. I turned my phone on for exactly 5 minutes while Walter was in the dining car. I didn't read the messages, but I did check the news. There it was, a small item in the society section of the New York Post. The headline read, "Sterling Wedding Disaster, Guests Left Hungry and Humiliated." The article was brief but brutal. It described how a wedding at a Hudson Valley estate had collapsed spectacularly when the caterers walked out mid-service. The venue owner expelled everyone for trespassing, and the bride's family failed to appear. There was speculation about financial problems and fraud, but what caught my attention was the comment section. Someone who'd been there, using an anonymous account, had posted the real story. They described how Vanessa Sterling had banned her own parents from attending despite them paying for everything, how she'd displayed their photo at the gate with "access denied" written across it, how the parents had retaliated by canceling all services. The comments below were split. Half the people praised us for standing up to ungrateful children. The other half called us petty and cruel. One commenter asked how parents could abandon their daughter on her wedding day, regardless of what she'd done. That comment stuck with me. It bothered me more than I wanted to admit. I showed it to Walter when he came back. He read it twice and told me we didn't abandon her. She abandoned us first. But I realized something sitting in that train compartment watching America roll by. Vanessa didn't think she'd done anything wrong. In her mind, we were an embarrassment, an obstacle to her new life. She'd grown up with privilege we'd given her, and somewhere along the way, she'd started to believe it was hers by birthright rather than our sacrifice. We'd created that monster. Every time we'd said yes when we should have said no. Every time we'd paid for something beyond our means because she wanted it. Every time we'd accepted being treated as less than because we didn't want to rock the boat. The train stopped in Denver for 4 hours. Walter and I got off to stretch our legs and walk through the station. That's when I saw her. A woman about Vanessa's age, maybe 32 or 33, sitting on a bench crying while talking on her phone. She wasn't trying to hide it, just letting the tears fall while she spoke. I only caught fragments of her conversation as we passed. She was telling someone that her mother had been right all along, that she should have listened, that she'd made a terrible mistake and didn't know how to fix it. Walter squeezed my hand. He'd heard it too. We didn't stop, didn't intrude, but that woman's voice followed us back to the train. I wondered if someday Vanessa would sound like that, if there would come a moment when she understood what she'd lost. By the time we reached the Rocky Mountains, I'd made peace with something important. Whether Vanessa ever apologized or not, whether she ever understood or not, we'd done the right thing. Not because it felt good, it didn't. But because staying would have killed us slowly, would have taught her that there were no consequences for cruelty, no price for treating people as disposable. The scenery outside our window was breathtaking. Snow-capped peaks, pine forests, valleys that seemed to go on forever. Walter pointed out every beautiful thing he saw, like a kid on his first trip. I realized this was the first real vacation we'd taken since our honeymoon 43 years ago. Every other trip had been for Vanessa. College visits, birthday celebrations, holidays at expensive resorts she'd chosen. We were somewhere in Utah when my phone buzzed in my purse. I'd forgotten to turn it off after checking the news. Walter looked at me, and I could see the question in his eyes. I pulled out the phone. It was a text from a number I didn't recognize. The message was short. It said that Vanessa had been served with a lawsuit from Joe Moretti for property damage and breach of contract. Apparently, in the chaos after we left, someone had broken a 17th century mirror and damaged several pieces of antique furniture. Joe was seeking $20,000 in damages. The text was from Victoria Sterling. She demanded that we pay the lawsuit since it was our daughter who'd been responsible. She said it was the least we could do after destroying the wedding. I showed Walter. He asked what I was going to do. I typed out a response, deleted it, typed another one, deleted that too. Finally, I wrote something simple. I told Victoria that Vanessa was an adult who made her own choices and would need to handle her own consequences. I added that any further contact would be considered harassment and reported to authorities. Then I blocked the number, and every other number associated with that family. I blocked Vanessa's number too, not out of spite, but out of self-preservation. Walter watched me do it and nodded slowly. We spent that evening in the observation car, watching the sun set over the desert. A retired couple from Ohio sat across from us. They'd been married 51 years. The wife told us they'd just sold their house and were traveling the country full-time. She said their kids had been furious, had accused them of squandering their inheritance. But she and her husband looked at each other and laughed. She said they'd spent 50 years taking care of everyone else. Now it was their turn. Her husband raised his beer in a toast. To selfishness, he called it. To finally putting yourself first. Walter and I clinked our coffee cups against his beer. I looked at my husband's face, really looked at it for the first time in years. The lines around his eyes were deeper, his hair was completely gray, but he was smiling, actually smiling. Not the tired, stressed smile of a man working himself to death. A real smile. That's when I knew we'd survive this. Not just survive, we'd thrive. The train rolled on through the night, carrying us away from everything we'd known and toward something we couldn't quite see yet. But for the first time in 40 years, the uncertainty didn't scare me. It felt like freedom. We arrived in San Francisco on a Tuesday morning. The city was draped in fog, and the air smelled like salt water and fresh bread. Our hotel was modest, nothing fancy, but it had a view of the bay, and that was enough. Walter stood at the window for 20 minutes just watching the water, not saying anything. That afternoon, we walked through Chinatown and bought soup dumplings from a tiny restaurant where nobody spoke English. We sat on a bench in Portsmouth Square and watched old men play Chinese chess. One of them reminded me of Walter's father, same careful way of thinking through each move, same quiet confidence. It was peaceful. For 3 days, we were just tourists. We rode the cable cars, visited Alcatraz, walked across the Golden Gate Bridge. Walter took pictures with the disposable camera we'd bought, something we hadn't done in decades. Every photo was of something beautiful, something that had nothing to do with obligation or sacrifice. But on the 4th day, my phone rang. I'd kept it on, but hadn't given the number to anyone except the bank and our insurance company. It was neither. It was Marcus, my old boss from the catering company I'd worked at for 18 years before managing the Manhattan kitchens. Marcus was 78 now, retired in Florida. He told me he'd heard about what happened at the wedding. Word traveled fast in the restaurant industry. He asked if I was okay, if Walter and I needed anything. I told him we were fine, that we were actually on vacation, the first real one we'd taken in 4 decades. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then Marcus told me something I hadn't known. He said that about 2 years ago, Vanessa had come to see him. She'd asked him questions about my work, about how much money I'd made over the years, about whether I had any investments or properties he knew about. My stomach tightened. I asked Marcus what he'd told her. He said he'd kept it vague, told her that I was a hard worker who'd always managed money carefully. He said something about Vanessa's questions had felt wrong to him, predatory somehow, so he hadn't given her details. I thanked him and hung up. Walter saw my face and asked what was wrong. I told him about the call. We sat there on the hotel bed, letting this new information sink in. Vanessa hadn't just recently decided we were embarrassing. She'd been planning something for at least 2 years, researching our finances, calculating what we were worth to her. That's when Walter said something that surprised me. He told me we should go see a lawyer. Not to sue Vanessa, he knew I wouldn't do that, but to make sure everything we had left was protected. To make sure that if she tried anything else, there would be walls in place. We found a law office the next morning. The attorney was a woman in her 50s named Patricia Chen. She listened to our story without interrupting, taking notes on a yellow legal pad. When we finished, she sat back in her chair and told us we'd actually been smarter than we realized. The donation to St. Jude's Hospice was protected. Vanessa couldn't sue to reclaim it because it had been our money, freely given. The sale of Walter's father's garage was clean. The property had been in Walter's name alone, and Vanessa had no claim to it. Our apartment was rent-controlled and in both our names. Our Social Security and pensions were untouchable. But Patricia warned us about something else. She said that adult children sometimes tried to have elderly parents declared mentally incompetent to gain control of their assets. She asked if Vanessa had ever suggested we were forgetful, confused, or unable to make decisions. Walter and I looked at each other. The answer was yes. Over the past year, Vanessa had made comments, little things, asking if I'd forgotten conversations we'd had, suggesting that Walter was getting too old to drive safely, recommending we give her power of attorney so she could help us manage our bills. We'd brushed it off at the time, thought she was just being concerned. Now those comments took on a darker meaning. Patricia suggested we get comprehensive cognitive evaluations from a neurologist, document that we were both mentally sound. She also recommended updating our wills to be very specific about Vanessa receiving nothing, with a statement explaining why. That way, if she tried to contest it later, there would be a clear record of our intentions while we were demonstrably competent. We spent the rest of that week in San Francisco doing exactly that. The cognitive tests were thorough and mildly humiliating, answering questions about what year it was, drawing clocks, remembering lists of words. But we both passed with perfect scores. The neurologist wrote detailed letters confirming we had no signs of dementia, confusion, or impaired judgment. Patricia drafted new wills. Everything we had would go to charities we chose: the hospice, a scholarship fund for kids from working-class families, an organization that helped elderly people escape financial abuse. Vanessa was specifically named and specifically excluded, with a paragraph explaining that she had demonstrated through her actions that she valued money over family. Signing those documents felt final in a way I hadn't expected. Walter's hand shook as he wrote his name. But when it was done, there was relief, too. She couldn't hurt us anymore, not financially anyway. We extended our stay in San Francisco by another week, used some of the garage money to rent a car and drive down the Pacific Coast Highway. We stopped in tiny towns, ate at diners, slept in motels with neon signs. It felt like we were 25 again, before Vanessa was born, when it was just the two of us figuring out life together. Somewhere near Big Sur, we stopped at a viewpoint overlooking the ocean. The sun was setting, turning the water into liquid gold. Walter put his arm around me and said something I'll never forget. He told me that he'd spent 40 years thinking he was building a legacy by sacrificing for our daughter. But now he understood that the real legacy was us. Our marriage, our integrity, the fact that we'd chosen dignity over desperation. I leaned against him and watched the sun disappear. For the first time since that horrible morning at the mansion gates, I felt something close to peace. But peace doesn't last forever. 2 days later, back in San Francisco, I made the mistake of checking my email. There were hundreds of messages, most of them spam, but one subject line caught my eye. It was from Preston Sterling's lawyer. The email informed us that Preston and Vanessa were pursuing legal action against us for fraud, emotional distress, and intentional sabotage of their wedding. They were seeking $200,000 in damages. The lawyer's letter was full of legal language I barely understood, but the threat was clear. I showed it to Walter. His face went pale. We just protected our assets, but we didn't have money for a legal battle. Patricia had been expensive enough. A lawsuit like this could drain everything we had left. I called Patricia immediately. She told us not to panic, that the lawsuit was almost certainly a bluff. She said she'd respond on our behalf and that most likely they'd realize they had no case and drop it. But she warned us that even if they did drop it, Vanessa wasn't going to give up. People who felt entitled to other people's money rarely did. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the little girl Vanessa had been. The one who'd crawled into our bed during thunderstorms. The one who'd made us breakfast in bed for Mother's Day with burned toast and too sweet coffee. The one who'd hugged us and told us we were the best parents in the world. Where had that girl gone? When did she turn into someone who could weaponize the legal system against her own parents? Walter found me sitting in the dark at 3 a.m. He sat down beside me and held my hand. He told me we couldn't change her. All we could do was protect ourselves and try to live whatever time we had left on our own terms. He was right, but knowing he was right didn't make it hurt less. Patricia called us 3 days later with news. Preston and Vanessa's lawsuit had been filed formally. She'd reviewed all the documentation and told us it was even weaker than she'd initially thought. Their claims were mostly based on emotional harm and reputational damage. They had no actual proof of fraud because there had been no fraud. We'd paid for services, then legally canceled those services. But there was something else in the filing that caught Patricia's attention. Vanessa had submitted an affidavit claiming we'd stolen money from her. She stated that over the years, we'd borrowed nearly $90,000 from her for various emergencies and never paid it back. She claimed she had proof. I felt my blood run cold. It was a complete lie. We'd never borrowed a penny from Vanessa. If anything, the money had always flowed the other way. But if she had somehow manufactured documents, fake loan agreements, forged receipts, this could get complicated. Patricia asked if we had financial records going back several years, bank statements, tax returns, anything that could show our income and expenditures. I told her we had everything. I'd kept meticulous records since the 1980s. Every receipt, every bank statement, every tax return, all organized in boxes in our apartment closet. She told us we needed to go back to New York and retrieve those documents immediately. The preliminary hearing was in 3 weeks. Without our financial records, Vanessa's fake narrative might gain traction. We cut our trip short and flew back to New York the next day. Walking back into our Brooklyn apartment felt strange, like entering a life we'd already left behind. The air was stale, the plants were dead, but everything else was exactly as we'd left it. I went straight to the closet and pulled out the boxes. 30 years of financial documentation. Walter spread it all out on our dining room table, and we started organizing. Bank statements showing every deposit, every withdrawal, credit card bills, tax returns proving our income, receipts from everything we'd paid for Vanessa over the years, the tennis lessons, the French tutoring, the college tuition, the wedding expenses. It took us 2 full days to organize everything chronologically. When we were done, the paper trail was irrefutable. We'd never borrowed from Vanessa because we'd never needed to. Our income had been modest but steady. Every major expense was documented. But as I went through those papers, I found something else, something I'd forgotten about. Tucked into a folder marked Vanessa College was a letter from the financial aid office at her university. It was from her junior year 9 years ago. The letter stated that Vanessa had applied for student loans without our knowledge, listing us as co-signers without our permission. The university had flagged it as suspicious because our income information didn't match what Vanessa had submitted. They'd denied the loans and warned that falsifying financial aid applications was grounds for expulsion. I'd confronted Vanessa about it at the time. She'd cried and apologized, said she'd been stressed and made a mistake, that she'd never do it again. I'd believed her. We'd paid off her tuition ourselves rather than risk her academic career. But now, looking at that letter with fresh eyes, I saw a pattern. This hadn't been her first manipulation. It was just the first one that had failed. I showed the letter to Patricia. She read it twice and told me this was exactly what we needed. It established a history of Vanessa attempting financial fraud involving us. Combined with our financial records, it completely destroyed her credibility. But Patricia also told us something that made my stomach sink. She said that Vanessa's lawyer had filed a motion to depose us separately. They wanted to interview Walter alone, then me alone, looking for inconsistencies in our stories. They were betting that Walter, being older and more emotional about the situation, might crack under pressure. I looked at my husband. He was 74 years old. The stress of the past month had already aged him. His hands shook more than they used to. He'd started having trouble sleeping. The idea of sitting in a room with hostile lawyers interrogating him made me furious. Patricia prepared us for the depositions. She explained what kinds of questions they'd ask, how to answer clearly without volunteering extra information. She told us to take our time, to ask for breaks if we needed them, to drink water, to breathe. Walter's deposition was scheduled first. I wasn't allowed in the room. I sat in the waiting area for 3 hours, watching the clock, imagining what they were asking him. When he finally came out, he looked exhausted but steady. He told me he'd done fine, that he'd stuck to the facts, that they'd tried to rattle him but couldn't. My deposition was the next day. The lawyer representing Vanessa and Preston was a man in his 40s who smiled too much. He started with easy questions: my name, age, occupation, how long I'd been married. Then he shifted. He asked me if I loved my daughter. I told him I had loved the person I thought she was. He asked if I regretted my actions at the wedding. I said no. He asked if I understood that my vindictive behavior had cost my daughter her marriage. Preston had apparently called off the wedding permanently after the disaster. I told him I hadn't cost her anything. She'd made her choices, and choices have consequences. He pressed harder. Suggested I was a bitter old woman who couldn't handle not being the center of attention. Implied that Walter and I were mentally unstable. Asked if I'd recently been evaluated for dementia. That's when I pulled out the neurologist's report, handed it directly to him. Told him I'd been evaluated 3 weeks ago and scored perfectly on every test. Then I placed our complete financial records on the table. 30 years of documentation, every dollar accounted for. I watched his face fall. He'd expected confused elderly people he could intimidate. Instead, he got organized, prepared, documented proof that his clients were liars. The deposition ended 20 minutes later. Patricia told us afterward that she'd never seen a case collapse so quickly. Vanessa's lawyer knew he had nothing. The fake loan claims were provably false. The emotional damage claims were subjective and weak. And now we had documentation showing Vanessa had attempted fraud before. Patricia predicted they'd drop the lawsuit within a week. She was right. 4 days later, we received notice that Preston and Vanessa were withdrawing their complaint. No explanation, no apology, just a quiet retreat. But the notice came with something else. A personal letter from Vanessa. Not a legal document, just a handwritten note on expensive stationery. I almost threw it away without reading it. Walter saw me holding it and asked if I wanted him to read it first. I told him no. We'd come this far. I could handle whatever she had to say. The letter was 3 pages long. She started by saying she'd had time to think about everything that happened. She claimed she understood now that she'd hurt us. But then the letter shifted. She said we'd hurt her too, that we'd always made her feel like she had to be perfect, that the pressure to live up to our sacrifices had been crushing. She said excluding us from the wedding had been Preston's mother's idea, that she'd gone along with it because she was afraid of losing him. She said the pregnancy lie had been panic, desperation. She said she knew she'd made mistakes, but that we'd made mistakes too. The letter ended with a request. She wanted to meet, to talk, to see if we could find a way forward as a family. I read it twice. Walter read it 3 times. We sat at our kitchen table, that letter between us, neither of us sure what to feel. Part of me wanted to believe her, wanted to think that maybe, finally, she'd learned something. But another part of me, the part that had seen her toast our exclusion, that had caught her in lie after lie, knew better. Walter asked what I wanted to do. I told him the truth. I didn't know. I kept Vanessa's letter in my purse for a week, reading it over and over, trying to hear her real voice underneath the carefully chosen words. Walter caught me one evening, sitting in the dark with it spread out on my lap. He turned on the light and told me we needed to make a decision one way or another. This limbo was eating at both of us. The problem was, I didn't trust my own judgment anymore. 40 years of putting Vanessa first had trained me to see what I wanted to see, to believe what I wanted to believe. I needed an outside perspective, someone who knew the situation but wasn't emotionally invested. I called Patricia. She listened as I read the letter aloud over the phone. When I finished, there was a long silence. Then she asked me a single question. She wanted to know if Vanessa had ever actually apologized in the letter, or if she'd only acknowledged that she'd hurt us while also blaming us for her actions. I read the letter again with that lens. Patricia was right. Vanessa had written things like, "I understand you felt hurt," and "I know my actions caused problems," but never once wrote, "I'm sorry," or "I was wrong." Every admission of wrongdoing came with a justification or a counteraccusation. Patricia told me she saw this pattern frequently. People who weren't actually remorseful but needed something would write letters that seemed apologetic on the surface while maintaining that they'd been justified in their actions. Real apologies, she said, were simpler. They acknowledged harm, took responsibility, and didn't include but clauses. I thanked her and hung up. Walter was watching me from the doorway. He asked what Patricia had said. I told him she thought the letter was manipulation, not remorse. Walter nodded slowly and said he'd come to the same conclusion but hadn't wanted to say it out loud. We decided not to respond. Not yes, not no, just silence. If Vanessa truly wanted reconciliation, she'd need to do more than send one carefully worded letter. She'd need to show, through consistent action over time, that she'd actually changed. 3 days later, my phone rang. I didn't recognize the number. Against my better judgment, I answered. It was Victoria Sterling. Her voice was different than I'd expected. Quieter, more tired. She told me she'd been thinking about everything that had happened. She said she wanted me to know that she'd encouraged Vanessa to exclude us from the wedding, that it had been her idea, and that she regretted it now. I asked her why she was telling me this. There was a pause. Then she admitted that Preston had called off the engagement permanently. He'd found out that Vanessa had been lying about several things, not just the pregnancy, but also about her education, her work history, her family background. Everything Vanessa had told the Sterlings about us was false. She'd claimed we were neglectful, absent, that she'd practically raised herself. Victoria said she'd believed those stories because they fit what she wanted to believe. That Vanessa was some kind of Cinderella who'd overcome difficult circumstances through determination and grace. Finding out the truth, that Vanessa was actually a spoiled child who'd been handed everything and still wanted more, had been humiliating for their whole family. I asked Victoria what she wanted from me. She said nothing. She just wanted me to know the truth. Then she hung up. I told Walter about the call. He said it didn't change anything. Victoria's regret didn't undo the harm, but it did confirm something important. Vanessa's carefully constructed facade had finally cracked in front of the people she'd been trying to impress. That evening, I got a text from Marcus, my old boss. He'd heard through the restaurant industry grapevine that Vanessa had applied for a job at a high-end catering company in Manhattan. She'd listed skills and experience she didn't have, claiming she'd worked alongside me for years, learning the business. The company had called Marcus to verify. He'd told them the truth, that Vanessa had never worked in the industry, that she'd actually looked down on my work as beneath her. She didn't get the job. Marcus wanted me to know because he figured she'd probably blame me when she found out he'd been honest. I thanked him. Another piece of the puzzle fell into place. Vanessa wasn't just trying to reconcile with us. She was trying to rebuild her life after Preston left, and she thought we could be useful. The letter hadn't been about family. It had been about access to our connections and our reputation in an industry she suddenly needed. Walter said we should block her completely, make sure she couldn't contact us at all. But I had a different idea. I told him we should accept her request to meet. Just once. Not because I wanted reconciliation, but because I wanted to hear what she'd say to our faces when she couldn't hide behind a letter or a lawyer. Walter looked at me like I was crazy. He said it would just hurt us more, that there was no point. But I needed this. I needed to look my daughter in the eye one more time and know for certain that we'd made the right choice. I texted Vanessa's number, told her we'd meet her for coffee, neutral location, 1 hour, no Preston, no Victoria, just the 3 of us. She responded within minutes, agreed to everything, suggested a coffee shop in Midtown the following Tuesday at 2 o'clock. The days leading up to that meeting were tense. Walter kept asking if I was sure, if I really wanted to do this. I told him I needed closure. Not the closure she might offer, but the closure that would come from seeing clearly who she'd become. Tuesday afternoon arrived. We took the subway to Midtown and found the coffee shop 20 minutes early. Sat at a table in the back where we could see the door. Ordered coffee we didn't drink. Waited. Vanessa arrived exactly on time. She looked different, thinner, tired. The expensive clothes she'd worn at the wedding had been replaced with more modest outfits. Her hair was simpler, no jewelry except a plain watch. She sat down across from us and said hello. Her voice was small. She thanked us for agreeing to meet. Then she launched into what sounded like a rehearsed speech. She told us she'd made mistakes, that she'd been influenced by Preston's family, that she'd lost sight of what mattered. She said she wanted to rebuild our relationship. That family was the most important thing. I let her talk, watched her face, listened to the words she chose. And slowly, I realized Patricia had been right. This wasn't remorse. This was a performance. Vanessa was saying what she thought we wanted to hear, using the same manipulation techniques she'd used her entire life. When she finished, she looked at us expectantly, waiting for us to accept, to forgive, to make it all go away. I asked her one question. I wanted to know if she'd actually written the letter herself, or if someone had helped her. She looked confused, admitted that Preston's lawyer had suggested some of the phrasing before Preston left, said he'd thought it might help with the lawsuit. There it was. Even the letter had been calculated, drafted with legal advice, designed to serve a purpose beyond actual healing. Walter asked her about the fake pregnancy claim, about the lies she'd told the Sterlings about us, about the loan fraud she'd attempted in college. Vanessa's face hardened. She said those were different situations, that we were twisting things, that we'd never understood the pressure she was under. I stood up, told Walter we were leaving. Vanessa grabbed my arm and begged us to wait, said we hadn't given her a fair chance to explain. I removed her hand gently and told her that 40 years had been more than a fair chance, that every choice we'd made for her, every sacrifice we'd accepted, every boundary we'd ignored, all of it had been us giving her chances. She started crying. Real tears this time, I think. But they weren't tears of remorse. They were tears of frustration. She'd played what she thought was the right card, and it hadn't worked. She couldn't understand why her usual techniques weren't breaking us down. As we walked toward the door, Vanessa called after us. She said we'd regret this, that we'd end up alone and miserable, that we'd need her someday and she wouldn't be there. I turned back one last time, looked at this woman I'd carried inside me, raised, sacrificed everything for, and I told her the truth. I said that we were already alone because she'd left us years ago. We'd just been too devoted to see it, and that being alone was better than being used. We walked out into the Manhattan afternoon. Walter took my hand. We walked for blocks without speaking, letting the city noise fill the silence between us. When we finally stopped, we were at Grand Central Terminal. Walter looked up at the painted ceiling, that famous constellation map, and said maybe we should take another trip. Somewhere new, somewhere we'd never been. I agreed. We went to the ticket counter and asked what trains were leaving that evening. The agent showed us options: Portland, Maine, Montreal, Charleston. We chose Montreal on impulse. Grabbed dinner at a terminal restaurant, bought toothbrushes and a change of clothes from a nearby drugstore, and boarded the train at 7:15. As New York disappeared behind us, I felt something shift inside my chest. Not happiness exactly, but something like freedom. The final thread connecting us to Vanessa had been cut, not by anger or spite, but by the clear-eyed recognition that some relationships, no matter how much you've invested, aren't meant to be saved. Walter fell asleep against the window. I watched him breathe, this man who'd stood by me through everything. We'd lost a daughter. But we still had each other. We still had our dignity. We still had time. That would have to be enough. Montreal was cold even in early October. We stayed for 3 days in a small hotel near Old Montreal, wandering cobblestone streets and eating food we couldn't pronounce. Neither of us spoke French beyond basic pleasantries, but somehow that made it better. We were completely anonymous, just two elderly tourists with no history, no obligations, no daughter trying to manipulate us. On the 3rd day, Walter woke up and told me he'd been thinking about something. He said we'd spent our whole lives reacting to Vanessa, providing what she wanted, then protecting ourselves from her when she turned on us. But we'd never actually decided what we wanted our lives to be. We'd just been surviving. He was right. Even this trip, spontaneous as it was, had been about escape rather than purpose. We'd been running away instead of running toward something. We spent that morning at a cafe discussing what we actually wanted, not what we thought we should want, not what would make us look good or be practical, but what would genuinely make us happy. The conversation was harder than I expected. After 72 years, you'd think I'd know myself. But I'd spent so long being a mother and a worker that I wasn't sure who Beatrice was underneath. Walter said he wanted to take a woodworking class. He'd always been fascinated by carpentry, but never had time. I surprised myself by saying I wanted to volunteer at a senior center, not managing a kitchen or being in charge, just helping, being useful without the weight of responsibility. Simple things, but things that were ours. We returned to New York on a Friday evening. Our apartment felt even smaller after our travels. The boxes of financial documents were still on the dining room table, a reminder of the legal battle we'd just survived. I started to pack them away when something fell out of one of the folders. It was an old photograph I'd forgotten about. Vanessa at age 7, gap-toothed and sunburned, wearing a ridiculous hat at the beach. Walter and I were on either side of her, young and tired, but smiling. I remembered that day. We'd driven to Coney Island on Walter's only day off in 3 weeks. Vanessa had made us build sandcastles for hours, then cried when the tide came in and destroyed them. I'd told her that was life. Things don't last forever. You enjoy them while they're here and let them go when it's time. 7-year-old Vanessa had found that explanation acceptable. 32-year-old Vanessa never would have. I showed the photo to Walter. He studied it for a long moment, then placed it face down in the box. He told me he loved the child in that picture, but that child was gone. Holding on to a memory wouldn't bring her back. The following Monday, something unexpected happened. I got a call from St. Jude's Hospice, the organization where I'd donated our $50,000. The director wanted to thank me personally. She told me the donation had arrived at a critical time. They'd been on the verge of cutting services, and our contribution allowed them to keep their doors open for another year. She asked if I'd be willing to visit the hospice, not as a donor requirement, just because she thought I might want to see the impact. I told her we'd come that week. St. Jude's was in Queens, not far from where Walter's factory used to be. The building was old but clean, filled with soft light and the quiet sounds of people receiving care. The director, a woman named Carmen, who couldn't have been more than 45, walked us through the facility. She introduced us to staff members who worked with terminal patients, helping them spend their final days with dignity. We met a nurse who'd been there for 20 years, a social worker who helped families navigate the impossible logistics of death, a volunteer who read books to patients who couldn't read anymore themselves. Carmen explained that many of their patients were elderly people estranged from family, people whose children had stopped visiting, whose spouses had died, who faced the end alone. She said our donation funded a program that paired volunteers with these isolated patients, someone to hold their hand, someone to listen to their stories, someone to make sure they didn't die completely alone. I thought about what Vanessa had said in the coffee shop, that Walter and I would end up alone and miserable. She'd meant it as a threat, but standing in that hospice, watching people choose to be present for strangers in their darkest moments, I realized alone and abandoned were different things. We might not have a daughter who cared about us, but we had each other. We had the capacity to care about others. We weren't abandoned. We were free. As we were leaving, a patient's door opened. An old man, probably mid-80s, shuffled out with a walker. He saw us and smiled. Told Carmen we must be the angels who'd saved them. Carmen explained who we were, what we'd done. The man reached out and gripped my hand with surprising strength. He told us his name was Arthur, that he'd been a mechanic for 50 years, saved everything for his kids' education, paid for weddings and down payments on houses. Then, when he got sick, his children had fought over his estate before he was even dead. None of them visited anymore. He said he'd planned to die angry and bitter. But the volunteer who came to see him every day, a woman named Grace who'd lost her own father to cancer, had shown him that not everyone disappears when things get hard, that not everyone was like his kids. Arthur said our money had paid for Grace's training and stipend, that we'd given him something he thought he'd lost forever, faith that some people still cared. I couldn't speak. Walter squeezed my shoulder. Arthur patted my hand one more time and shuffled back to his room. On the drive home, neither of us said much, but I think we both understood that we'd stumbled into something important. The money we'd burned hadn't been wasted. It had been transformed. Instead of funding a lie, Vanessa's wedding to someone she'd lied to, a ceremony celebrating a relationship built on manipulation, it had funded truth, real care, actual human connection. That evening, I finally put the boxes away, filed everything properly, closed the lid on that chapter of our lives. When I finished, I found Walter at the kitchen table with his laptop open. He'd found a woodworking class at the community center, 8-week beginner course starting next month. I sat down and opened my own laptop, searched for volunteer opportunities, found a listing for a senior meal program that needed people to help serve lunch and chat with participants. I filled out the application. For the first time in months, maybe years, I felt something like excitement. Not the anxious excitement of planning someone else's event or meeting someone else's needs. Just the quiet anticipation of doing something because I wanted to, because it mattered to me. 2 weeks passed. Walter started his woodworking class and came home with sawdust in his hair and stories about the other students. I got accepted to volunteer at the meal program and discovered I loved the slower pace, the casual conversations, the fact that nobody needed me to be perfect or in charge. We were building something new. Small, maybe. Quiet. But ours. Then, on a Tuesday afternoon, my phone rang. Unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. It was Preston Sterling. He apologized for calling, said he'd gotten my number from Vanessa's phone before he'd left her. He told me he needed to say something he should have said months ago. He explained that his mother had pushed hard for Vanessa to exclude us from the wedding. Victoria had seen the photo we'd sent, saw our modest clothes and working-class background, and decided we'd be an embarrassment. Preston admitted he'd been too weak to stand up to his mother, that he'd gone along with it because it was easier than fighting. But after everything fell apart, after he'd learned the truth about who Vanessa really was, he'd started seeing his mother differently too. The way she judged people by their bank accounts. The way she'd raised him to value appearance over substance. The way she'd encouraged him to treat Walter and me as disposable. Preston said he'd called off his engagement to Vanessa not just because she'd lied, but because he'd realized he'd been complicit in something cruel. He told me he was in therapy now, trying to understand why he'd been so willing to hurt good people to maintain his family's image. He said he didn't expect forgiveness. He just wanted me to know that what happened at those gates had changed him. Made him question everything about how he'd been raised and who he wanted to be. I thanked him for calling, told him I appreciated his honesty. He asked if there was anything he could do to make amends. I told him the best thing he could do was live differently going forward. Be the kind of person who wouldn't exclude someone's parents from their wedding. Raise his future children, if he had them, to value people over status. He promised he would try. We hung up. Walter asked what that was about. I told him. He shook his head and said it was good Preston was learning, but that his education had come at our expense. That we'd been the collateral damage in someone else's character development. He was right. But somehow, knowing that Preston had been affected, that he'd actually reflected and changed, it meant the whole disaster hadn't been meaningless. Pain that leads to growth isn't wasted pain. I told Walter that. He considered it, then nodded slowly. Said maybe we'd become accidental teachers. Hadn't planned on it, wouldn't have chosen it, but in the wreckage of everything, maybe someone had learned something. That night, lying in bed, I thought about Vanessa, wondered if she'd learned anything at all, if she ever would, if someday, when she was old and alone, she'd understand what she'd lost. But then I realized I didn't need to know. Her journey was hers. Mine was mine. And for the first time in decades, mine didn't revolve around her. I reached over and held Walter's hand in the dark. Tomorrow I'd volunteer at the meal program. He'd work on his woodworking project. We'd make dinner together, watch the news, go to bed early. Simple things. But after everything we'd been through, simple felt revolutionary. The lawsuit was formally dismissed on a cold November morning. Patricia called to give us the news and to let us know that the judge had included a note in the dismissal. He'd reviewed all the documentation and stated that bringing such a frivolous case bordered on abuse of the legal system. Vanessa and Preston's lawyer would be required to take ethics training. It felt anticlimactic. After months of stress, of preparing and worrying, it ended with a phone call and a piece of paper. But maybe that was fitting. The big dramatic endings only happen in movies. Real life tends to fade out rather than explode. Walter and I took the train to Patricia's office to sign the final paperwork. She told us there was one more thing we needed to know. Vanessa had declared bankruptcy 2 weeks earlier. Without Preston's financial support and without any real job skills, she'd burned through what little money she had. The apartment she'd been renting in Manhattan was being foreclosed. She'd moved back in with a friend from college. Patricia said Vanessa's lawyer had hinted that she might reach out to us again, that the bankruptcy might make her desperate enough to try one more manipulation. Patricia wanted us to be prepared. I told her we were already prepared. We'd changed our phone numbers, set up a P.O. box for our mail, and instructed our building manager not to let her into our apartment. We'd built walls, not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. Some people don't stop until you make them stop. On the walk back to the subway, Walter asked me if I ever felt guilty, if I wondered whether we should have tried harder, given her more chances, been more forgiving. I told him the truth. Sometimes, yes. Late at night when sleep wouldn't come, I'd replay moments from her childhood and wonder what we'd done wrong, where we'd made the mistake that led to who she became. But then morning would come, and I'd remember that we didn't create her choices. We'd given her everything we had. What she did with that was on her. The volunteer work at the senior meal program became the highlight of my weeks. There was a regular group of people who came, some dealing with loneliness after losing spouses, some with limited mobility who appreciated the company, some who just enjoyed having somewhere to go where they were expected and welcomed. One woman, Dorothy, reminded me of myself in some ways. She'd worked her whole life as a seamstress, raised 3 kids alone after her husband died young. Her children rarely called. They were busy with their own lives, she said, and she understood. But I could see the hurt underneath that understanding. I started sitting with Dorothy during meals, just talking, sharing stories. She told me about growing up during World War II, about the first television her family got, about teaching herself to read music from library books. I told her about managing restaurant kitchens, about the celebrities I'd met, about the time a senator sent his steak back 3 times because it wasn't exactly right. One afternoon, Dorothy told me her daughter had called that morning. First time in 6 months. She'd asked Dorothy for money, a loan, she'd called it, though they both knew it would never be repaid. Dorothy had said no for the first time in her life. She cried as she told me this, said she felt guilty, felt like a bad mother. I held her hand and told her she'd done the right thing. That saying no to your children doesn't mean you don't love them. Sometimes it's the most loving thing you can do. Dorothy looked at me with watery eyes and asked how I knew that. So I told her, about Vanessa, about the wedding, about everything. When I finished, Dorothy squeezed my hand and said she was sorry I'd gone through that. But she thanked me too. Said knowing she wasn't the only mother dealing with this made her feel less alone. That conversation rippled through our volunteer group. Other people started sharing their own stories. Parents who'd been pushed aside, grandparents who never saw their grandchildren. People whose families treated them like ATMs or inconveniences rather than human beings worthy of respect. We accidentally created a support group, nothing formal, just people who understood, who wouldn't judge you for setting boundaries or tell you that blood was thicker than water, who knew that sometimes the healthiest thing you can do is walk away. Walter's woodworking class ended in December. His final project was a jewelry box made of cherry wood. It was beautiful, dovetail joints, a felt-lined interior, a small brass latch. He gave it to me for Christmas, even though we'd agreed not to exchange gifts. I opened it and found a folded piece of paper inside. It was our train tickets to San Francisco from earlier that year, the ones that had started this whole second chapter of our lives. Walter told me he'd kept them as a reminder, that we'd boarded that train as victims, people whose daughter had broken them. But we'd arrived as survivors, and now, months later, we were something more than that. We were people who'd chosen themselves. I cried, happy tears this time. I told Walter I loved him. He said he'd known that for 43 years, but it was nice to hear it anyway. We spent Christmas Day volunteering at St. Jude's Hospice. They'd invited us to a small party for patients and staff. Arthur was still there, weaker now, but holding on. Grace, his volunteer, sat beside him, helping him eat. He saw us and smiled, told everyone we were his Christmas angels. Carmen pulled me aside during the party. She told me they'd received another donation the week before, $25,000, anonymous. But the donor had left a note requesting the money go toward the same volunteer program our donation had funded. The note was signed simply, "Someone who learned too late." My heart stopped. I asked Carmen if there was any way to know who sent it. She said no. The donation had been structured specifically to protect anonymity. But she thought I might want to know. I stood there processing this. It could have been anyone. Preston, feeling guilty. Victoria, trying to make amends. Or, and this was the thought that made my chest tight, Vanessa. Maybe she'd sold something valuable. Maybe she'd taken what little she had and tried to do something right with it. I'd never know for certain. And maybe that was okay. Maybe the not knowing was part of learning to let go. Walter found me standing by the window, lost in thought. He asked if I was all right. I told him about the donation, about my suspicion. He said it didn't matter who sent it. What mattered was that someone who'd caused harm had tried to create something good. That was progress, even if we'd never see the person who made it. As we left St. Jude's that evening, snow was starting to fall. Big, soft flakes that caught in the streetlights. Walter wrapped his arm around me, and we walked slowly to the subway station. That night, I pulled out the old photo from the beach. Vanessa at 7, gap-toothed and happy. Walter and I, young and tired. I looked at it for a long time, then placed it in the jewelry box Walter had made. Not to forget, but to preserve. A memory of who we'd all been before everything got complicated. The new year came quietly. We didn't go to Times Square or have any big celebration. Just watched the countdown on TV from our couch, holding hands. When midnight struck, Walter turned to me and said, "This would be a good year." He could feel it. I believed him. Not because everything was perfect, it wasn't. Not because we'd gotten our happy ending. We hadn't, not the way we'd imagined it 40 years ago. But because we'd survived. We'd protected our dignity. We'd found new purpose. We'd learned that family isn't just who you're related to, but who shows up, who stays, who values you. In January, I got a letter forwarded from our old address. It was from Vanessa. Short this time. Just 3 sentences. She wrote that she was sorry for everything, that she understood if we never wanted to see her again, and that she hoped someday we'd be proud of who she became. No manipulation, no excuses, just those 3 sentences. Walter asked what I wanted to do about it. I told him I needed time to think. Maybe weeks, maybe months, maybe years, maybe forever. But for the first time, I wasn't angry at the possibility of her reaching out. I was just neutral. She'd taken the first small step. Whether she took more, whether those steps led anywhere, that wasn't my responsibility anymore. We kept living. That's what we did. Walter finished his second woodworking project, a bookshelf. I continued volunteering, formed real friendships with people like Dorothy. We took another train trip in March, this time to New Orleans. We ate beignets and listened to jazz and danced in our hotel room at 2 a.m. because we could. One afternoon in April, I was serving lunch at the meal program when a young woman walked in. She looked nervous, out of place. She asked if this was where people volunteered, said she was interested in helping but didn't have experience. I showed her around, explained what we did, introduced her to the regulars. She told me her name was Sarah and that she was trying to rebuild her life after making some mistakes. She didn't elaborate, and I didn't ask. Everyone's got a story. What mattered was that she'd shown up. Sarah became a regular volunteer. She was good with people, patient and kind. After a few weeks, she told me she'd been estranged from her parents for 5 years. She'd treated them badly, taken them for granted, said terrible things. When she'd finally tried to apologize, they'd told her it was too late. They'd moved and left no forwarding address. She said volunteering here, being around elderly people, reminded her what she'd lost. She couldn't make it right with her parents, but maybe she could be better to other people's parents. I didn't tell Sarah my story. It wasn't necessary, but I did tell her that if her parents had cut her off completely, it was probably because they'd given her too many chances already. That the fact she was doing this work meant she was growing, even if they'd never see it. Sarah cried, said she hoped they knew somehow, that they were happy, that they'd found peace. I told her I was certain they had. That night, I took Vanessa's letter out of the jewelry box, read it again. Those 3 simple sentences, no demands, no manipulation, just a small acknowledgement and a hope. I wasn't ready to respond yet. Might never be. But I didn't throw the letter away either. I put it back in the box, next to the beach photo, next to the train tickets. All pieces of a complicated story that wasn't finished yet. Walter came up behind me and looked into the box. He asked if I thought we'd done the right thing, all of it. The wedding sabotage, the lawsuit defense, the walls we'd built. I told him yes, absolutely yes. Because we'd protected something precious. Our own humanity, our own worth, our right to be treated with basic respect. And in doing so, we'd accidentally found something we didn't know we were looking for. A life that was truly ours. We might not have the daughter we'd dreamed of, but we had each other. We had purpose. We had dignity. We had stories to tell and time to tell them. We had cold winter mornings and jazz in New Orleans and cherrywood jewelry boxes and people like Dorothy and Arthur and Sarah who reminded us that connection was still possible. We'd lost something huge when we drove away from those mansion gates, but we'd gained ourselves, and in the end, that was enough, more than enough. It was everything. So when people ask me now, at the meal program, at St. Jude's, in the park where Walter and I walk on Sunday mornings, when they ask if I have children, I smile. And I tell them about the life Walter and I built, about the places we've seen, about the people we've helped, about the simple, precious freedom of being exactly who we are. Sometimes I add that I had a daughter once, that it didn't work out the way I'd hoped, that family can be complicated, and that you can survive even the losses you thought would break you. Mostly, though, I tell them I'm happy, because against all odds, after everything that happened, it's true. I'm 72 years old. My husband is 74. We're not wealthy. We're not famous. We don't have the picture-perfect family we once dreamed of. But we wake up every morning free from manipulation, free from obligation, free to be kind to each other and to people who appreciate it. And that freedom? That's worth more than any wedding, more than any inheritance, more than any relationship based on lies. If you're watching this from somewhere in the world, wondering if it's ever okay to walk away from family, to protect yourself even when it feels selfish, I want you to know something. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is close the door. Not out of hatred, but out of love. Love for yourself. Love for the life you deserve. love for the truth. Don't let anyone make you feel guilty for choosing peace. So tell me, where are you watching from? What's your story? I'd love to hear from you in the comments, and if this story resonated with you, if it helped you feel less alone, please subscribe. Share it with someone who might need to hear it. Let's build a community of people who understand that sometimes survival looks like walking away. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being here. Thank you for reminding me that even broken stories can help someone else heal.